hills and dales, the breadth and depth of England's green and pleasant lands, you are bound to stumble at some point or another into the centre of a ring of weathered and ancient stones, some recumbent, some still standing like the teeth of a long dead dragon that haunted the land. But who built them, and why? These questions have been considered and debated by historians and archaeologists alike since William Stukeley first charted the avenues and structures of Avebury Stone Circle in Wiltshire and brought them back into public consciousness. And yet, were they really erected by Druids marking the position of the planets, or megalithic man tracing the serpentine course of Mother Earth's power lines? Crop circles, an apparently modern phenomenon, may hold the key to understanding these dragons and rings. But to answer these and many other questions, we're going to have to stretch the fabric of reality and look at what really makes the universe tick. In 1921, the rambling enthusiast, photographer and antiquarian Alfred Watkins had, as he put it, a flood of ancestral memory. He was looking at a map of his local Herefordshire when it occurred to him how ancient landmarks and prehistoric places appeared to be in a straight line. After spending some years studying these alignments and photographing them, he wrote about his discoveries in his book, The Old Straight Track, and adopted the name Ley Lines. Ley literally means a woodland clearing or meadow, and comes from the Anglo-Saxon word lair. This has nothing to do with the current understanding of the phrase ley line, and yet maybe Watkins was onto something, because the word ley is etymologically linked to the word leot, meaning fire and light. Combining these meanings gives us an understanding of Watkins' perspective, a cleared space open to the light, like, for example, a trackway through the woods, with the hills being marked by beacons. More recently, the word ley has become linked with the apparent lines of energy that trace their course across the surface of the planet, and are known by the ancients as chi, or dragon lines. But how do we find them? And what do they do? The most conventional way of detecting ley lines is through the archaic art of dowsing, but yet again we have blundered into a minefield of misinformation. Most dowsers use rods or pendulums as their stock-in-trade tools, though many ingenious devices have been developed or discovered that do the job as well or better. However, and it is a big however, contrary to a lot of public opinion, a rod or pendulum neither moves of its own accord or is possessed by spirits. It is us who move it. Human beings sense far more information about their surroundings than they actually use. For example, the visible spectrum of light that we day to day acknowledge is a fraction of the entire range of light, and excludes all but a small part of the ultraviolet and infrared spectrum. Our senses still pick up that information, but our brains exclude it as not useful for our survival, and so don't include or process that information. In the same manner, our bodies sense water flow by the electromagnetic and geodetic currents it creates. Indeed, one particular tribe claimed to detect water by smell. However, we block out that information and disregard its importance. Subliminally, though, we can still tap into that information and ask our subconscious to indicate those messages by way of minute muscle responses measured by a rod held in tension, or a weight held freely between finger and thumb. You can make a pendulum from anything heavy like a ring tied on a length of cotton, and try for yourself by asking your subconscious to make minute muscle movements to enable the pendulum to swing in response. With a little practice, you can ask yourself to swing the pendulum in response to questions, presence of water, and even hidden objects. If you were to take a quartz crystal, you might well expect the pendulum to swing in response to its presence or assumed energy. With two crystals, you might well experience an interaction between them, and here comes a second misconception. Are the crystals talking to each other or exchanging energy? Well, yes, and absolutely no. To have a better understanding of the processes involved in what we are observing, we first need to examine the work of the 20th century psychologist and scientist Wilhelm Reich. Using a high-quality microscope for its time, Reich was continuing the research established by H. Charlton Bastian, a contemporary of Louis Pasteur, on decaying food. He noticed that under high magnification he could see luminous blue-green globules being released by the decaying food, and described these as some form of biological ether. He likened this to bions, a form of nanobacteria which appeared to be neither living or non-living, which had been first named and researched by Bastian. Although pleased with his rediscovery of bions, Reich found side effects of the observation occurring. His eyes started to burn, causing a form of conjunctivitis, and his skin began tanning. He tried numerous ways of shielding his experiments to both protect himself and contain the bions, and by 1940 he had found that the best method was to surround the material by an insulated box using layers of organic and inorganic materials. In the meantime, Reich had decided that the particles he could see through the microscope were actually an unidentified energy or radiation form, which in turn caused the conjunctivitis and tanning. It was only whilst experimenting with a minute source of radiation in the same box that he began to notice strange effects. In his report of 1951, published as the Oranier experiment, Reich noticed that a Geiger counter placed in the box he was now calling an accumulator recorded a constant increase in radiation until it finally jammed. Simultaneously, huge amounts of oppressive-looking storm clouds gathered around the vicinity, whilst a strange electrically charged purple glow could be seen at night, emitting from the surrounding area. Even when the radioactive material was removed from the accumulator, the effects continued to increase, with the laboratory animals dying unexplainedly, scientists and members of staff falling sick and finding themselves in depression, and eventually the surrounding vegetation and trees bending like rubber, blackening and dying. Even stranger were the appearances of unidentifiable animated lights in the sky, which at the time Reich saw as interplanetary craft, but later referred to as air, or primordial energy. The energy that Reich had found, firstly in his accumulator, and later in the surrounding environment and sky, he named orgone, and deduced that it was the energetic building block of the universe. Using his colleague, Sigmund Freud's psychotherapeutic techniques, he studied the relationship between orgone flow in the human body and physical and psychological illness, and as a result of over 20 years worth of experimentation, he felt able to suggest a number of properties of this energy. He noticed that not only was it present everywhere and in everything, and that it had no measurable inertia or weight, but he also felt that it was the medium in which light moved and electromagnetic and gravitational fields exerted force. He observed that under the right conditions, which turned out to be neither rare nor unusual, matter could be created from the superimposition of tiny streams of organic energy, and more importantly, the presence of consciousness and volition, that is, life itself, would arise. One of the most impacting results in these experiments for us is that this life force energy accumulates between layers. The more layers, the more accumulation, and that this energy has electromagnetic and gravitational components, both of which we are sensitive to. Thinking back for a minute to our pair of crystals showing an apparent interaction, this then is the first part of the answer we're looking for, but again, not the whole picture. We have to bring to bear the work of the 19th century mathematician Maxwell and his equations of electrodynamics. There are 4 versions of Maxwell's equations which are taught as standard to every physicist and engineer up to and indeed beyond higher level degree. They have been accepted as the standard by even Einstein himself and form the basis of his time and space theories. They are, however, a bastardized editorial of an original 20 postulated equations. Calculated by Maxwell on the foundation of his predecessor's work, like Faraday, and seen as too complicated by his peers, he was forced to simplify them and reduce the complexity of the apparently erroneous components. These were then edited by Oliver Heaviside and further symmetrically regauged by Hendrik Lorentz. However, it is these so-called insignificant components that prove to be of most consequence in terms of how we evaluate our physical world, both with and without them. The most important of which is the fact that conventional science, based on the accepted Maxwell equations, measure time as a linear, step-frame element with gravitation and electromagnetism as separate parts operating in an inert time-space vacuum. However, Maxwell originally postulated that time wasn't flat, but curved, and secondly, that space wasn't a vacuum, but rather a mass-free force which operates in this curved time to effectively create force and mass as we understand it, and subsequently matter. To make that easier to understand, let's put it into a slightly different model using a theory developed in the late 6th century BCE by the Greek philosopher and scientist Pythagoras. It is thought that Pythagoras discovered the mathematical laws of the triangle, but evidence of triangular mathematics and its relationship to the circle can be found in the structure of the pyramids in Egypt. These predate him by another 2,000 years and produce important harmonic proportions in their chambers. However, Pythagoras and his students believed that numbers were the ultimate reality. We have all heard the famous René Descartes phrase, "I think, therefore I am." But what does it mean? Every time we look in the mirror, we see a reflection of ourselves. Every time we listen to ourselves speak, we hear ourselves. Every time we touch a part of ourselves, we feel ourselves. We think that we know that we exist because we sense ourselves on all levels. In other words, to know we exist, we have to have a reflection, or second point, to compare ourselves to. The Pythagorean philosophy takes as a starting point for the universe a single, unique point that needs, or indeed generates, a second reference point to compare itself to. Because the second point is effectively a part of the first, they are linked. So joining these two reference points together, we arrive at a line of singular dimension. But how long is that line? How long is a piece of string? For that line to be measurable, it needs a third reference point to measure itself against. And of course, that third reference point within the same field establishes the length of the line plus a second dimension of width, creating a single planar field. From its own perspective, it has no height or depth until it can be viewed from another reference point, which by its nature creates solid. But again, how big is that solid? We still don't know how large it is until we use another reference point to rotate or mirror it. And it is that fourth reference point we call time, the dimension that the solid moves through. With the awareness of time comes volition and relative movement in space, which, by the way, with the reproduction of units from a parent, the ability to perceive and react to the environment, and the evolution of the unit in the direction of higher development have been cited as the four main qualities that typify living things. This then defines the apparent limit of the human consciousness, as at this stage humankind has no reference point to establish the shape of time itself, and is merely able to see it as a series of snapshots arranged by the brain as best it can in a linear fashion. This leads to a number of thoughts and observations. Referring to the two-dimensional model that we can understand, imagine for a minute a group of beings whose perception leads them to see their world like a flat piece of paper with no apparent height. And imagine a pen lying on that paper representing a three or more dimensional being. How big would it appear to be? The answer is the size of the edge of the pen where it meets the paper. Now, if you stood the pen on its tip, touching the paper, how big would it seem? The size of the tip of the pen on the paper. If you stuck the pen through the paper, how big would it be? The size of the hole it makes going through the paper. And finally, if you held the pen away from the paper, how big would it appear to be? It wouldn't be visible to the two-dimensional beings at all. Our first observation then is that from our three-dimensional human perspective, beings that can operate in four or more dimensions only present the aspect of themselves that interacts in our three-dimensional perspective.
Look into the face of the boy. Learn about yourself. Innocent as personified, or depravity. Say yeah.
How many times have you been driving home and before you know it, you're back in no time and have missed most of the journey? Conversely, how many times do you sit in a traffic jam for absolutely hours, moving at 0 miles an hour, tapping your fingers on the dashboard, check the clock and find only 2 minutes has passed?
Travelers, here we